Just getting ready to start. Welcome in, everybody. All right, 7:04, I'm going to start. So welcome, everyone. My name is Lynn Sowden. I'm co-chair of our outreach committee for Valley Forge Audubon Society and one of our walk leaders. And I'm looking forward to introducing Andrew and then having us hear from him for this time. A couple logistical things. If you would make sure, please, that you are muted throughout the presentation. And also, if you would mute your video, we will do that behind the scenes as well, but just to make sure we're not using a bandwidth. And we are recording this program. So if for any reason that doesn't work for you or you can't stay for the whole time, we are recording it and we will have it on our website at valleyforgeaudubon.org. So absolutely, you can look at it again later and view it at your leisure. We will be submitting questions through the chat, and then Andrew will be answering those at the end of his program. So if you have questions as we go through, please do put them in the chat. And it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew. I had the fun of meeting him in July of 2021, and we'll all get to see how passionate he is about trees and native plants in the natural world as we talk tonight. And of course, that's fitting because he and I met while we were birding with various friends and family back in July of 2021. I love, Andrew, that you describe yourself as an urban forester, and he does absolutely have great credentials for that. He has a bachelor's in environmental science, master's in biology. He's an ISA certified arborist, and he is president of an ecological restoration nonprofit called Community Canopy Project, which they started in 2020. And so he does work in person and online, encouraging this deeper integration of nature into the spaces where we work and live and play. And he's going to talk about that tonight. He's also online and provides user-friendly content there. So you can see him on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And you can see here on his intro slide how you can get his handle for those. So his aim is always to educate and inspire, and that's what he's going to do for us tonight. I was teasing him that we ought to call this Native Trees and the Birds Who Love Them. So he's going to take it away. And again, if you have questions as we go through, please put them in the chat. So Andrew, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you all for having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about native plants, particularly the trees and shrubs, and how we can plant a lot of these on our property to help our bird friends. So primarily, I'm a plant person, but I do love birds as well, and I occasionally get out and bird with a couple of my friends, Katie and Adam. So shout out to them if they're here. But as Lynn mentioned, I'm an ISA certified arborist. I'm located in the Plymouth Meeting and White Marsh area where my nonprofit does a lot of our restoration work. And I work as an urban forester, and I'm online uploading videos about these topics. So by the end of this talk, I hope you can leave this presentation with maybe a short list of maybe 1 or 2 trees and some shrubs that you can add to your property to help wildlife and to help our bird friends. So yeah, I wanted to start with a couple basic definitions. So I think we may all be aware of these definitions, but just wanted to start off with them. So a native plant is one that evolved and grew naturally in an area without human introduction. And over evolutionary time, these native plants have formed complex ecological relationships with other organisms in that ecosystem. And that's important because non-native plants are ones that humans brought over or may have moved around the world. And they typically lack these relationships between other organisms in that ecosystem. An invasive plant is a type of non-native plant that can cause harm to cause economic or environmental harm or harm human health or all of those. So I have a picture here of a white oak. This is a great native plant. We'll talk a lot about oaks in this presentation. A non-native plant here, a crepe myrtle. Not invasive, doesn't spread outside of cultivation, but is not native historically to the US. And an invasive plant. This is a Norway maple, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but it is one of the worst invasive trees in our area. We'll be talking mainly about woody plants today. So a woody plant is just one that has wood. It has a, produces wood as a structural tissue, as a hard stem. And a woody shrub is or a shrub is typically defined as a multi-stemmed, lower, small growing woody plant, like this spice bush here. And a tree is typically defined as a single stemmed, not always, but usually a single stemmed plant that gets much taller than a shrub. So usually much taller than 15 or 20 feet. Um, so there's mixed definitions, but that's usually the definition that's common. Um, so that leaves us the question that we're going to be talking more about today is how do we measure the wildlife value of a plant? What plants provide the most to wildlife and particularly to birds? And there are a few factors that you can look at, a few ways to measure the wildlife value of a plant. And recently, within the last few years, you may have heard of Dr. Doug Tallamy. He's done a lot of work. He's an entomologist at the University of Delaware, who's done a lot of research on native plants and invasive plants and how many Lepidoptera use those plants. And Lepidoptera are just caterpillars or butterflies and moths. So butterflies and moths as larvae are caterpillars, and they are the most important we'll talk about it, but they're the most important link in the food web between plants and higher animals. So essentially, Doug Tallamy's way of looking at the wildlife value of a plant is seeing how many caterpillars, how many butterflies and moths are feeding on these plants as caterpillars. And essentially, the more Lepidoptera a plant supports, the more ecological value that plant has. But plants can also provide a lot more to our wildlife. They can provide shelter, like this shagbark hickory. A lot of insects will take shelter under these long peeling strips of a mature shagbark hickory. Even bats can take shelter in here and sleep in under these peeling plates of the bark. And if you think of, old hollow sycamores, you can usually find some owls or some other birds taking shelter in there. Evergreen trees like pine trees provide good shelter in the winter, especially. And mangrove trees, we don't have mangrove ecosystems up here, but they provide a lot of shelter and support for fish and other wildlife. And we can also think about the flowers and the fruits of a plant. If this plant produces a lot of fruit or supports a lot of pollinators, its wildlife value is going to be great. So we're going to primarily be focusing on Lepidoptera because that's the most important today. And I also will touch on a few other things. But so getting into the Lepidoptera a little bit more. So as I mentioned, Lepidoptera are just butterfly and moth species. And as larvae, they are caterpillars, as we know. And so they are incredibly important because they move more energy from plants to higher consumers than any other type of leaf-eating animal. So as larvae, these caterpillars feed on the leaves of plants, and essentially they make that energy that's in the leaf available to higher organisms in that food web. So for example, a bird typically can't really eat the leaf of a tree to get energy. And so if there was no caterpillar here, it would be impossible for a lot of higher consumers to get energy from plants. So caterpillars, by feeding on the leaves, are taking energy from the leaf and essentially making it accessible to the rest of the food web. So the caterpillars eat the leaves, the birds will eat the caterpillars, and then higher consumers will hunt or eat those small birds, and you have hawks and foxes and other predators that will eat the lower consumers, and you have energy flowing through the food web. So from the sun to the plant, all the way up the food web. And if we think of, if you're not a huge fan of plants, you can think of them as food factories, because that's essentially what they are. And if we're interested in gardening and landscaping to support our birds, we have to be interested in gardening and landscaping for our insects, and primarily for our Lepidoptera. So they're extremely important. And I also wanted to mention that native plants support far more caterpillars than non-native plants. And Dr. Doug Talmy has the research, a lot of research that shows this, and they've done quite extensive studies on this topic. So here's a slide, an image from one of his presentations, actually. A pair of chickadees needs 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise 3 baby chicks. So even a small bird like a chickadee needs a ton of caterpillars, a lot of energy to raise their young and to support their reproductive efforts. And this is common for the vast majority of our native terrestrial birds. Some studies say that up to 96% of our native terrestrial bird species feed their young and raise their young with caterpillars and other insects. They can't raise them, most of them can't raise them with seeds or fruit. They need native insects, or they need insects to raise their young. So essentially, the more insects, the more caterpillars that we can make available to them through our landscaping, through the plants that we plant, the happier they'll be. So the Lepidoptera, as we said, they feed on the leaves, but not all plants support the same amount of caterpillars. And we'll see that some native plants support a lot more than others. And of course, as we mentioned, non-native plants and invasive plants support far, far fewer insects than our native plants. A lot of Lepidoptera are specialists, which means they feed only on a certain type of plant. That's like the monarch butterfly. It needs milkweed to eat and to turn into a butterfly, into an adult, to reproduce. So we plant milkweed to support the monarchs. That's an example of a specialist. And some Lepidoptera are generalists, where they can eat multiple types of different trees. They can eat maples and oaks and birches and things like that. But a lot of them are specialists and require very specific native plants or plants within a certain genus. So there's this great resource that I use when I'm thinking about plants to add into my landscape, and it can be found at the nwf.org. It's the Native Plant Finder. If you Google or search Native Plant Finder, this is usually the top result. But you can type in your zip code. I'll type in Plymouth Meeting 19462. And what it'll do is give you a list of the best native plants for supporting caterpillars in your area. So it has different categories. It has the herbaceous plants here, so the flowers and grasses. These are non-woody plants, so if you're looking to add flowers or herbaceous material to your garden, you can see which ones support the most. And as you can see, goldenrods are the best herbaceous plant for supporting caterpillars. And they support over 120 species, strawberry, native sunflower species, and so on. You can click view all and see, what plants you're thinking of adding to your landscape and how many Lepidoptera species they support. And you can do the same for trees and shrubs, and we'll talk a lot about these species, but you can see oak is by far the best native plant for wildlife, and it supports over 500 species of Lepidoptera, which is incredible. And then you can see, if you click on one of these, this website is still in beta, so they're constantly improving it, but you can see that it lists the species within that genus that is found in your area, so the different types of maples that are found here. And also it will list out the species that feed on those native maples. So it can give you a better idea of what insects you'll be supporting, what caterpillars you'll be raising for our birds to eat. So that's a cool resource I wanted to mention. I also used that website to make this slide so we can compare. I just wanted to show that not all native plants are equally valuable. So even though these 3 tree species are all native to Southeast Pennsylvania, they don't support nearly the same amount of Lepidoptera and therefore wildlife. So we have the Kentucky coffee tree, supports only 3 species of caterpillars. The tulip tree supports 20, and then the oak, as we mentioned, supports over 500. So you can see, again, these are all native species. They all do well. They're all good trees, but they don't support the same amount of wildlife. And if you really only have room for 1 or 2 trees, you may want to plant ones that are higher on this scale that support more caterpillars, so you're providing more food for our bird species. And that's not to say that these are, you know, inferior plants or anything. We still use these plants in restoration projects and stuff sometimes, but we definitely tend to plant more of the more ecologically valuable species like oaks, and occasionally we'll plant a tulip tree or a tulip poplar, and just to get some good diversity. And also, tulip trees are great for pollinators when they're in bloom. They're buzzing with bees, and so they support pollinators as well. And we also use the coffee tree. It's a great street tree. It's a tough, urban tolerant tree. So they have their uses. It's just, you know, if supporting birds is important to you, you definitely want to try to plant the higher, the more valuable ones. And this is kind of the same for the flowers and herbaceous plants. So we have goldenrod at the very top, supports a ton of really good caterpillar species and also specialist pollinators. If you've seen goldenrod in bloom in the fall, you know that it's covered with all sorts of great native bees and all sorts of other insects. Goldenrod is really a top plant, and it's definitely something you should consider adding to your garden if you have space. Violet is in the middle of the pack. It's interesting. A lot of people kind of want to get rid of violets out of their lawns and view them as weeds, but they're really quite good herbaceous plants. They support 32 caterpillar species, which is more than a tulip tree, which is kind of funny because a violet will only get, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches tall, whereas a tulip tree can grow upwards of 150 feet. And a violet supports more species. And then mountain mint, you can see it only supports 4. Again, that's not to say mountain mint is a bad plant. I have tons of it in my garden, and when it's in bloom, it's an absolute powerhouse for pollinators. It's really fragrant, and bees and other pollinators love it. So just to give you an idea that not all native plants support the same amount of wildlife. Before I talk more about specific plants, I wanted to give a little bit of background on our area, southeastern Pennsylvania, and just provide a little bit more information. We're in historic Lenape territory, so the Lenape people historically lived here and managed these lands and forests extensively. Our area was mostly oak hickory forest or oak hickory woodlands. And Pennsylvania mostly was forested. There were some grasslands, but historically most of it was wooded. And the Lenape would manage this land by using prescribed fire. So they would set controlled burns, which would burn through the woodland, and it would essentially select for fire-tolerant, thicker barked and nut-producing trees. So over time, that would lead to a forest of mature oaks, hickories, and American chestnuts, which all support really great food, which all provide really great food and nuts that the people would eat, but also it would attract a lot of wildlife. And because the woods were more open, the fire would also kill the thinner barked fire intolerant species. So it would thin out a lot of the red maples, the sugar maples, the beeches, the birches, and you would end up with a more open woodland like this image on the left here. So you would have more sunlight getting to the ground, more shrubs could grow, which would also provide more berries, more fruit, and more nuts for people and for wildlife. So that would also attract large game animals like deer, elk, turkey, which the people would hunt for meat as well. So it provided, the way they managed the land provided a surplus of food for themselves and for wildlife. But after European settlement, the land management changed drastically. We, for the most part, completely stopped using fire to manage our landscapes, and that has led to this sort of image. This is kind of what we're used to seeing in our area now. Most of our woodlands are overly dense, very crowded, and there's not much light getting down to the ground. There aren't as many shrubs, largely because of deer overpopulation eating a lot of shrubs, but also just less light. And the species composition has changed as well. A lot of the thinner bark trees that would have been thinned out by controlled burns, like maples and beeches and birch, have been allowed to establish and are more abundant in woodlands than they historically were. And that has also unfortunately led to a decline in oak abundance and hickory abundance, and these species that provide the more ecological or more ecologically valuable species that provide more food for wildlife. This process is called mesophication, if you wanted to look into that more, but it's essentially as a result of fire suppression, and it leads to an establishment of these cooler, shadier, more dense woodlands. And of course, we have fragmented a lot of our remaining woodlands. We've developed a lot of them. Deer are overpopulated because we've eliminated their predators, and we've introduced hundreds of invasive plant species. So there's a lot of kind of threats and changes to our woodlands. So I wanted to talk briefly about an invasive species here. This is the Norway maple. It was introduced in 1756, almost 300 years ago. And it was introduced to Philadelphia, actually, first by John Bartram. And even though we have many native maple species in the eastern US, we have 5 or 6 native species at least. The Lepidoptera, the insects that feed on our native maple species, can't feed on Norway maple, even though they're closely related in the same genus. It's still a maple. And that's because the Eurasian continent and the North American continent started splitting apart, diverging over 80 million years ago. And that has led over 80 million years of evolution to different leaf chemistries and flowering times and growth rates. And so when we bring that Norway maple over back into the US, it has all sorts of different leaf chemistries that our native insects have not evolved with. They don't know how to use, they don't know how to eat it, and they lack the ability to break down these plants' defenses or toxins that may be in the leaf. So ultimately, Norway maple supports many fewer Lepidoptera than our native maples. So in the host database, which records insect host plants, or there's only 6 records of anything feeding on Norway maple, whereas over 200 species feed on the native maples, including red maple. And this is supported by more research from Doug Tallamy and his graduate students, which show that within the same genus, introduced plant species provide about 70% less food for insects than our native species. So that's just an example. And Norway maple is a pretty bad invasive species. It can seed into our woodlands. It's very shade tolerant, so it will creep up and shade things out over time. And if you have any small ones on your property, I definitely would recommend removing them. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum, the oaks are the best native plant for wildlife, as we mentioned. They support the most species of Lepidoptera, and this is true for 84% of US counties. So just about every county here in the light green color is where a native oak it can be found, so different species all throughout North America. And just about in every county where they're found, they support the most amount of Lepidoptera. So they're really at the top of the food web, helping to move energy through the food web. And they're called keystone species because without oaks in most of these ecosystems, they function and behave very differently. There's a lot less wildlife, and there's just it's a keystone plant that really needs to be there for those ecosystems to function. And luckily for us, there are 16 native species of oaks in Pennsylvania, and there's just about one oak for every soil type and soil moisture setting that you can think of. So it really leads us to being able to, they're so versatile that you can find one for just about any condition. So with that in mind, kind of the declining oak abundance in our woodlands for a number of reasons, and given their wildlife value, I think we need a lot more oaks, and we could certainly plant them more in our landscapes. It's not only that oaks support a ton of caterpillars, they're also very valuable for birds and for other wildlife because they produce acorns, which is a top food item for birds and for other wildlife as well. You can see a blue jay with at least 3 pin oak acorns. The acorn woodpecker out west caches hundreds of acorns and will defend those. So they're very valuable top food items for wildlife. Oaks are also generally long-lived and they're complex organisms. So as they age, they can live for upwards of 500, 600 years. And for these old growth oaks that may have been battered and broken by storms, there are, complex cavities and shelters within the tree that birds and other wildlife can take advantage of. And they also support hundreds of species of gall insects, which are these interesting species of stingless wasps that will develop on an oak twig or on a leaf, and they form these really interesting galls that come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors and textures, and they're really specific to oak species. So they'll develop inside of this protective gall, and then within a few months, they'll emerge as an adult as a flying insect like this. This is one of the gall wasps. And these are also food items for birds too, as they emerge as adults. And what's interesting is that there's parasites of these galls. So other insects with really long ovipositors that will try and come in and lay an egg on the developing gall on the inside, which there's all sorts of really complex interactions, and there's essentially a whole ecosystem centered around oaks. So they support a lot of great insects that will feed birds. So this is really just an outline. This is for you if you want to take a picture of this. And I mentioned that there's an oak for just about every soil type and every condition. If you have moist or wet soils on your property, I would recommend either of these species, the pin oak or the swamp white oak. If you have some drier soils on your property, I live at the top of a hill where soils are pretty dry. These are the species that will do better there. They're pretty drought tolerant. I planted a few white oaks in my backyard. If you have average to moist soils, these species are the ones you should look at, as well as a few others. And if you don't have a lot of space on your property, but you want an oak, you can explore these two options. These are kind of shrubbier oaks or smaller trees. So these can be kind of like a sprawling shrub, or they can sometimes grow into small trees. We'll take a closer look at that. And if you live in a place where there may be limestone or bedrock that has more alkaline soils, where your pH is above 7, or tends to be more basic, there are a few oaks that actually prefer alkaline soils over acidic. Most oaks prefer acidic soils, but if you live in one of those areas, you can plant either of these two species. So I just wanted to look more closely at these species and give you a few options if you're thinking about planting a native tree. So these are my favorite to use in the landscape in no particular order, but this is the swamp white oak, Quercus bicolor. It's called bicolor because there's a really nice contrast between the top of the leaf, which is like a glossy, really bright glossy green, and the underside of the leaf, which is pale and fuzzy and white. So it's pretty cool contrast. In the winter, they hang on to their dead leaves, and you can still kind of see a contrast. You can see the fuzzy undersides, and gives the tree a nice winter appearance. And it's a moderately fast growing tree. It's not super fast, but this is what sorry, let me try to move this zoom out of the way. This is what roughly a 30-year-old tree will look like, and a 70-year-old tree. So and these are great for moist or wet soils. In the wild, they grow on the edges of swamps or on the edge of stream banks. And it's a really adaptable oak, though, in the landscape. And it's often used as a street tree. So it's pretty tough. Just don't plant it where if you have really, really dry soil, it won't do well there. But if you have even average soils, this tree will thrive. It's a great one. White oak is my personal favorite species of tree. It prefers drier soil conditions than the swamp white oak, and it's a little bit slower growing. It's probably one of the slowest growing oaks, but it is a very long-lived tree and arguably the single most valuable tree to plant for wildlife in our area. So I'm always trying to plant white oaks wherever I can. We use them a lot in our restoration projects. And again, they support a lot of gall insects. This is the oak hedgehog gall, pretty cool spiky guy. And then the acorns are great, and it's a pretty adaptable tree. It doesn't like standing water, so plant it where the drainage is good. But you can plant it in moist, average, or dry soils, and it'll do just fine. This is what it looks like as it ages. And in my opinion, there's no tree better than an old growth white oak. Its shape is really complex, and it's great, and it supports a ton of wildlife. Pin oak is a great oak option as well. And this one is a very fast growing, relatively short-lived oak. And by short-lived, I mean 120 to 150 years typically in the wild when it's happy. And pin oak grows very straight. It grows a strong central trunk with tiny branches coming out. Now this one, it really prefers wet soils. It can be found again on swamp margins and stream banks. And although you can plant it in drier sites, it tends to get stressed and eventually will get diseased if you plant it in those areas. If you plant it where it wants to be, where the soil is moist or wet, I find that it tends to be able to fight off those diseases and fight off that stress a lot more easily. So in the 1950s and 60s, at least in a lot of the suburbs around our area, developers really loved planting pin oaks in everyone's front yard, or most people's front yard. And they did fine. They grew into large trees like this one within 50 or 60 years. But because most of these trees were planted, in upland sites where it's not as moist as the tree would prefer, they tend to get bacterial leaf scorch, which you may see if you have a pin oak. It causes this early browning of the leaf. And it's just, a result. Most people will blame the leaf scorch, but it's really a result of just, the tree not being able to fight off these common pathogens because it's stressed, because it's not in its preferred habitat. So if you have a wet or moist soil on your property, if you live near a stream, this is a great tree, super fast growing. It also needs acidic soil. If you live on limestone, or if your soil's alkaline, it won't do well there. It'll look sick like this. It'll be a light green, and that's called chlorosis. It's not able to pick up enough iron from the soil because the pH is too high. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But other than that, in its preferred conditions, it's a great tree. I mentioned if you live in places where the soil pH is higher, these two oaks actually prefer and can tolerate these higher soil pHs. So the bur oak and the chinkapin oak are really great species. The bur oak will get larger, and it has these really cool acorn caps that you can do all sorts of arts and craft projects with. The chinkapin oak is a smaller oak. It's still a large maturing species, but it won't get as giant as a bur oak, and it tends to have a more rounded crown. But both of these oaks will do really well and are pretty adaptable to a number of conditions. Even though they will grow in acidic soil, but these will perform far better than the other oaks in alkaline soil or on limestone. And then I mentioned the two dwarf species of oaks. Now these are more common in sandy soils in the coastal plains. So if you go out to the pinelands in New Jersey, you'll see them growing more commonly. This is the bare oak, Quercus ilicifolia, and this is the dwarf chinkapin oak or Quercus prinoides. And you can see this picture taken in the sandy soil. So both of these species really like kind of dry, very well drained soils in full sun. And unfortunately, if you don't have those conditions on your property and you don't have space for a big oak, I'm not sure how well these species do in like average or moist or even wet soil in like an average garden setting. Unfortunately, they're not too common in the nursery trade, so it's harder to get these species. But if you have kind of an exposed hillside or something that is dry, these species are good options if you want a smaller oak. And both of these species will produce acorns within only 3 to 5 years. So you can start having that acorn, that wildlife benefit of producing acorns at a very young age. So those are options too. When I tell folks about the benefits of planting oaks, I'm often, they often respond with, well, oaks are too big or they're not showy enough. And I have these points to just consider. If 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 there's not enough space for an oak, I understand it, but there's uh, if you can give it room, as much room as you can plant it further from your house. Generally, oaks are very strong wooded because they're slower growing and they tend not to break as easily as other trees in storms. But also, it takes a really long time for an oak to get to get to be a large size where it threatens your house. So it takes many, many decades for that to happen. So sometimes I tell folks to plant the oak and let the next homeowners deal with it because most times when you plant an oak, you're not gonna, it takes 40, 50, 60 years before that oak is um, large enough to really threaten anything. So even if you plant the oak and your neighbor or your the next homeowner comes in and they cut it down, it will have provided services for a long time. And there's also, with the oaks not being showy enough, it's true they don't have super showy flowers, but many oak species have really nice fall color that, most folks will plant a red maple or a sugar maple for fall color. But a lot of oak species have a bright red fall color as well. So that could be an option that would increase its showiness. And most folks want red buds and magnolias and Japanese maples and crepe myrtles because they're showy, they have bright flowers, or they have unique foliage and stuff. And I certainly agree that you can add these species in throughout your garden to add interest, to add different flowering times, to accent certain features of the garden. But they shouldn't be, in my opinion, they shouldn't be the center of your landscape. You should have something that supports a lot more wildlife. And as we mentioned, oaks are keystone species. And unfortunately, these species don't even come close to an oak's capacity to support wildlife. So those are just some points to consider. Okay, enough with oaks. Let's talk about some other top native trees for supporting Lepidoptera and feeding birds. So under oaks, the next best plant or the next best genus is Prunus, our native cherries and plums. And really the only species that does really well in our area is Prunus serotina, the black cherry. And it's a large maturing tree. It'll get up to 100 feet tall. And it has these nice flowers. It makes edible fruit for humans and for birds. And it supports over 430 caterpillar species. This species is typically considered like a weedy species. It's very good at seeding in everywhere. The birds will eat the berries and poop them out miles away, and they'll pop up everywhere. Um, and it's not typically one that you can buy in a nursery or in a landscape. People generally don't plant the species. But if you have it popping up in your yard and it landed in a good spot, or maybe you have a good spot for a tree in the back corner somewhere, you can plant it and or just let it grow, and it'll be a great wildlife supporting tree. There are other species of native prunus to our area, but a lot of them don't do too well and get tend to get diseased and stuff. But there are some, like American plum you can plant as a smaller prunus species, and that will support all of the same Lepidoptera. Willows are the next one. There are many species of native willows. The biggest one is the black willow. The weeping willow is a non-native species, so it's not going to support the insects that our native willows do. But the black willow and most willows really like wet soils or stream bank conditions or on the edges of ponds. So if you have, a pond or a stream in your yard, a black willow is a great choice. It'll grow into a medium-sized tree, and it has these really nice flowers that support a lot of early season pollinators. Pussy willow, and there are a number of other shrubby willows within the same genus that will support all the same insects, have beautiful flowers and flower buds, as you can see here, and they're just about flowering out now at this time. So they support a lot of early season pollinators as well. But willows are great species, typically not very common in the landscape, but really good choices for wet soils. The next group is the birches, and river birch is very commonly planted and commonly used in the landscape. And we have another birch that's pretty common in our area, the sweet or the black birch. And these are more common in wooded areas. It's another one of those species that's not really planted in landscaping. Um, but river birch is really popular, and it's often sold in these clumps of three stems. You get like a triple stemmed river birch, and it has really interesting peeling bark that gives a little bit of winter interest. But river birch, as its name suggests, it also likes to be near water or in wet soils. So if you have that spot in your property and you want a nice showy tree, this is a good choice as well. And it's more adaptable to drier soils too. So a good choice all around. The maples as well. We talked about the Norway maple, which is the invasive one, but we have many species of native maples. By far, the most commonly planted maple in our area is the red maple, and that tree occurs from the, up in Maine all the way down to Florida. So there's all sorts of different ecotypes of red maple and different cultivated varieties that have better fall color or are smaller. And there's all sorts of options, and it's, they get planted very frequently in our area. Sugar maple is also relatively commonly planted, but it's not doing as well, at least our type of sugar maple, the sugar maple that historically grew in the woods in our area, are seemingly struggling a little bit more with warmer temperatures and climate change and increased droughts and things like that. But there are more southern ecotypes of the sugar maple that are more drought tolerant that are starting to be brought up here. There's a number of different cultivars that you can plant that are more drought tolerant or have glossier leaves that can resist drought stress more. So sugar maple is another option. And typically box elder is viewed as another one of those weedy trees. It's very prolific along stream banks and wet soils, and it tends to really send out a lot of suckers or branches, and it tends not to have a nice form that people like in their landscape, so it's often not planted. But it's a great tree for stabilizing stream banks, and it grows very fast. It's an early successional species, so it can, it's a good tree, but probably not for the landscape. And silver maple is another good one if you have wet soils. Just don't plant it near your house because silver maples have pretty weak wood and will fall apart very, very frequently. Um, so the next group is crab apples. And crab apples are an odd example because most of the crab apples that you find in the nursery or at Lowe's or Home Depot are actually not native or are hybrids of native and non-native species. And a lot of times the cultivars of the crab apples that they're selling, they don't even really know the parentage or how that plant, if it's a hybrid or how that plant came to be. Um, we do have two native species of crab apples, but most of the crab apples you see in the woods or in naturalized areas are a result of escapees from cultivation. But the weird thing about crab apples is that, according to Doug Tallamy's research, is that the leaf chemistry of the non-native crab apples is so similar to the leaf chemistry of our native crab apples that our Lepidoptera can still feed on and still use the non-native species. So essentially, the non-native crab apples are acting as if they were native crab apples because they're still supporting all those insects. And it's a weird example. I think this is the only genus that this happens in, and I'm not sure why, but I guess the leaf chemistry did not diverge significantly from the common ancestor when Pangea was when the continents were together 80 million years ago. So that's an interesting thing. You can still plant these hybrid and cultivar crab apples and still support a lot of Lepidoptera as long as it's a green leafed cultivar and not like a purple leaf cultivar, because those typically don't our caterpillars aren't able to eat purple leaf stuff as often. And these can provide, they don't bloom as long as like a red bud or something like that, but you can see this is a really showy tree. And they're good small, if you have to plant under a power line or something, we use these as underwire trees in street tree pits and stuff like that. And they're really great. And they also will produce a bunch of fruit, which is eaten by a lot of birds in the winter and throughout winter. Okay, a few more. Hickories are really, unfortunately, underutilized in landscaping. Going back to our historical slide, most of our area was oak hickory forest. So hickory used to be very abundant in our area. In fact, Plymouth Township originally was called Hickory Town because of the abundance of hickories, but nowadays it's hard to find hickories in Plymouth Township. But they are really great trees. They support 240 plus species of caterpillars, and they also make really large nuts, which are edible for humans and for a lot of wildlife. This is the shellbark hickory. It's pretty uncommon in Pennsylvania, but it has similar bark to the shagbark, which we talked about earlier. And shagbark is a really great one to use for edible nuts. Yellow bud or bitternut hickory. The nuts aren't as I guess tasty as the other ones, but you can make vegetable oil with with the yellow bud um, nuts, which is a really interesting use for that. And there are a number of other species. There's mockernut and pignut hickory, but unfortunately, they're not very common in nurseries because they're tough to grow. They have a long taproot, and they can't really grow in those plastic pots. You have to kind of buy a hickory when it's like less than a foot tall, and plant it in your yard and fence it for a few years until it's able to grow. And many folks aren't willing to do that. Most folks want a nice big tree to plant in their yard right away. But if you have patience and you like the gratification of watching a tree grow from a sapling, a seedling, I would recommend trying some hickory in your yard. And lastly, pine trees. And there are two main types in our area. There are a few other native species, but eastern white pine is by far the most common. And Virginia pine prefers a little bit drier soils, but eastern white pine is pretty adaptable. I would say if you're planting a pine, to plant it away from the house. This is another one that will drop limbs frequently and break. They're very fast growing, but they're weak wooded. And so we like to, when we plant white pines, we like to plant them in groves of like 3 or 5 trees, ideally more, so that they can kind of shelter each other from the wind. They don't take as strong of a wind load, and they're not as likely to break. But these are great evergreen trees and support a lot of insects as well. So again, these I mentioned a little bit earlier about the very popular trees that most folks want to plant: the tulip poplars, the magnolias, the red buds, the black gums. They're all beautiful. They support good amount of pollinators, but they're lower on the Lepidoptera scale, so they're not going to be supporting as many caterpillars and as many birds. But as I mentioned, that doesn't mean these are bad plants. They certainly have a space in our gardens, but I think we should try to aim for the more ecologically valuable ones when we can. So that's it for trees. We'll talk a little bit about shrub species. And unfortunately, in our area, many of these shrub species are increasingly hard to find in the wild because deer are very, very abundant. They're more abundant, way more abundant than they historically were. So they really have essentially eliminated native shrubs from our understory. And a lack of natural lands management has also um, contributed to that. But these native shrubs really are beautiful, and they support a good amount of wildlife as well. So blueberries, they really prefer acidic conditions. So make sure to get your soil tested, or if you know your soil is very acidic, if you have, oaks growing, they historically would have grown in well-drained oak forests. These are really great to plant, and they support specialist pollinators as well. And of course, you get blueberries, which is a plus. Um, the alders, smooth alder is really the most common one in our area. This is another great one for wet soils along stream banks. We use this one in restoration projects a lot, and it will eventually grow taller, within 5 or 10 years, will grow taller out of deer browse height. So once it reaches that height, it's kind of good. It's a multi-stemmed shrub, and it can resprout from the base. So it's pretty deer resistant once it gets above the deer browse height. And the same goes for hazelnut. American hazelnut is a really great shrub option. I use it in my backyard. I have a nice grove of 3 of them, and they're actually flowering right now. And they are great for wildlife. And that's another one that will get above deer browse height. Blackberries and raspberries are kind of viewed as weedy species, and there are a number of invasive rubus species as well, so you have to make sure to know the ID of them. But the native rubus are a really good Lepidoptera species, and they also support good pollinators when they're in bloom. And then, of course, you get tasty fruit when they're ripe. So I kind of let them grow where I can in my backyard, and harvest the blackberries when they're ready. There's a few species of native rose, which is beautiful and has good potential use in the landscape. And as well, viburnum species. There are 5 or 6 native species of viburnums in our area. And this is Blackhall viburnum, which is a small tree or large shrub. And they support a good amount of caterpillars, and they're pretty showy and could make a good landscaping plant too. Meadowsweet spirea, that's a good native alternative to Japanese spirea, which is invasive in some parts of PA. Witch hazel has these really interesting flowers which bloom after the tree loses its leaves in late fall or in the winter, which is really interesting for a native plant. Sweet fern, this shrub here, is a really interesting looking shrub. It's not a fern, despite its common name, but it has these fern-like leaves that look really good. And this plant is good for dry soils in full sun. I have a few at my house, and I'm going to get a couple more this spring. But really cool looking plant. And then sumacs are again viewed more as like a weedy species. But if you're looking to naturalize an area of your property, or if you have like a steep slope that you don't want to mow anymore, staghorn sumac will really get the job done in holding that stream, that slope together and providing for wildlife. And a lot of birds will eat these individual berries off of this fruiting inflorescence here. So they make for good options as well. Okay, so enough with the caterpillars. We'll talk a little bit about some flowers that support birds. And I wanted to start with the ruby-throated hummingbird. If you're trying to support the ruby-throated hummingbird in our area, there are a number of plants that you could, a number of woody plants that you can plant. And this one is red buckeye. And it's not native to Pennsylvania. It's native to the southeastern US, but it has been planted up this far north for several decades, and it doesn't escape cultivation. And it's pollinated by the ruby-throated hummingbird. So there are a couple really nice red buckeyes throughout our area, and sometimes it's used as a street tree. There's a nice one at Jenkins Arboretum, and hummingbirds will really like this. It's a small tree, so it won't get much larger than this. Really nice flowers as well. This is trumpet vine, which is a native vine to Pennsylvania. It can be very aggressive in the right conditions. So you might have to keep it pruned or keep it off, from going to areas that you don't want it to go. But when it's in bloom, these flowers are spectacular, and you can see the trend with the long tubular red-orange flowers that will support the hummingbird. So this is an option if you're looking for like an aggressive vine to cover a big fence or something that gets full sun. You might want to try some trumpet vine. And this is kind of a more tame version of Japanese honeysuckle, which is a common invasive in our area. But this is a native coral honeysuckle, and again with the long tubular flowers. And it doesn't grow very rapidly. It kind of stays a nice shape. You'll have to do a little bit of pruning and maintenance to it, but you can train it up a trellis or a small fence, and really showy blooms. And then these flowers will mature into small, dark blue or black fruits, which are also eaten by birds. So that's an interesting vine that you could consider as well. So I also wanted to talk about fruits. A lot of plants will produce fruit, and there are a couple things to think about when thinking of fruiting plants for the landscape. You want to think about the fruit's nutritional value. So depending on the plant, some plants will produce fruit that are much more nutritious for birds than others. And you also want to try to plant a diversity of species that will fruit maybe at different times of the year, and also just to provide some different nutritional value for the birds. So this one in the bottom left here, this is Virginia creeper, which gets a lot of hate in our area. And I kind of let it do its thing in my backyard as well. And it can be a ground cover, kind of similar to Japanese Pachysandra, where it creeps along the ground, but it will also start to climb up native trees, and it will climb up fences, and it can be weedy in some areas, so you might have to keep it out or trim it back. But I have some Virginia creeper that's growing up my neighbor's fence on my side of my neighbor's fence, and it's south facing, so it gets a lot of sun. And Virginia creeper really only flowers and fruits when it's climbing up something and it's, in a sunny spot. So each summer when it blooms, it's just absolutely covered with a ton of native bees and sweat bees. And then those flowers will mature into these kind of really attractive blue fruits. And then the leaves will turn a bright red in the fall. So it's a pretty showy plant if you can train it up a small fence, or use it as a ground cover. It's definitely a cool plant, and you'll see cedar waxwings and other birds will really enjoy the fruit. This one up here is everyone's favorite, poison ivy, and it's another native vine, and it will creep along the ground, but it really only flowers and fruits like Virginia creeper when it's climbing up a tree or up a fence. and getting a good amount of sun. And even though these vines climb up trees, these two native vines, I've never seen them threaten the life of the tree. They don't get large enough to really add a ton of weight and threaten the structural integrity of the tree. They just kind of coexist with the tree. Whereas a lot of our invasive vines like English ivy and Asiatic bittersweet, those can actually threaten the life of the tree by shading out the leaves or adding a ton of weight and contributing to it toppling over. That's not the case for these natives. So if you have, again, a back corner of your property that you very rarely go to, and you can leave and allow your poison ivy to grow up the tree, and it's not growing out into your garden, it's just going up the tree. I would say to leave it because it will produce these bright white berries that are really high in fat, which birds will love to help them get through the winter. And this shrub we'll talk about in a second. So there have been a number of studies between native versus non-native fruiting shrubs. And most commonly in our area, Amur honeysuckle or bush honeysuckle is a non-native invasive shrub that produces really bright red berries. There have been a number of studies looking at the nutritional value of these invasive shrubs, and they're generally finding that native berries contain more fats, more carbs, and more nutrients that are more attractive to our native birds that help them get through the cold months. Whereas invasive fruits, or fruits from invasive plants, generally have a much lower nutritional value. And this quote is from this study, and they found that on average, they found that invasive shrubs fruited later than native plants and comprised a larger proportion of the total available fruits in late autumn, but the birds primarily consume the fruits of the native species throughout the autumn season. So even though they were less abundant, birds are preferentially looking for the native species, which makes sense. They evolved with these species, and it's a shame that a lot of our understory and invasive species have taken over and are not providing those nutritional fruits that the birds need. So this is from this book by Carolyn Summers, looking at the fat content of a number of native fruit-producing shrubs. So again, we mentioned that invasive shrub honeysuckle, like Amur honeysuckle, the berries are only 3 to 5% fat, which is much lower than a lot of our native species. So we mentioned Virginia creeper, that's almost 25% fat. Northern bayberry, which was this shrub here, is 50% fat. So these are really desirable fruits for birds. And then a couple of the shrubby dogwood species, the red twig dogwood, the gray dogwood, have higher fat berries that are desirable as well. And we talked about viburnum, spice bush is another good one. And the native version of the burning bush, American euonymus or American burning bush, has some attractive berries as well. So a few other native shrubs that you could consider if you're looking to plant some fruit-producing shrubs. Fragrant sumac is a great one because it is a smaller sumac. It's not as large as the other, staghorn sumac. And there's a cultivar called Grow Low that will stay kind of under 2 feet or so. So if you're looking for like more of a ground cover shrub, that's a good option. It has really nice fall color and produces berries. Northern bayberry we mentioned on the last slide as being half the berry is fat, and it's a semi-evergreen plant, so it will retain some of its leaves into winter. Blueberries we talked about, and coralberry here. This is one that I personally don't have much experience with, but I've seen it in the wild a few times, and can be a really cool addition to your garden if you can find it for sale. But really interesting looking plant. And just a few more. Spice bush is a really good one. It's also probably the most deer-resistant shrub in our area. They just don't like it. When they're really, really hungry, they'll eat it. But for the most part, this is the only native shrub that you'll find in most of our woodlands that can resist deer. Winterberry holly is a great one for wet or moist soils. It has these really bright red berries. You want to plant, make sure to plant male and female plants so they can cross-pollinate. Viburnums, we talked about again. There's a number of native viburnums that produce really nice, attractive fruits. Black elderberry, shrubby dogwoods, and chokeberries are all great options as well for stream banks or wet soils in your landscape. And elderberry and chokeberry are both edible for humans as well. And just wanted to mention a few fruit-producing trees. Hackberry is a great one. It's a tough, drought-tolerant tree. It's more of a medium-sized tree, but sometimes it can grow to larger sizes. But this is a really tough tree, and it's also tolerant of alkaline soils. Serviceberry is a small flowering tree. It's one of my favorite small trees, and it's my favorite fruit to eat. They're absolutely delicious. So if you get a chance to try them this spring, they are really good. American plum, we talked a little bit about, and it's a prunus, so it's going to support over 400 species of caterpillars. And eastern red cedar, while these kind of look like blueberries, but they're technically the cones of the red cedar. But a lot of birds will eat these cones as well. And black gum produces fruit if you have a tree that has female flowers on it. And a few more species. Flowering dogwood is a great option, but you have to plant it in part shade. Most folks will buy a flowering dogwood and plant it in full sun. They tend to burn up and not do as well when they're planted in full sun. They really need a little bit of shade throughout the day. So plant it under your big tree or plant it in a corner of your house where it gets some shade. The American holly is a good one. It's an evergreen and will keep these red berries throughout the winter as well, which is good. You'll get flocks of robins and other birds will take turns at eating all of those. We talked about crab apples, and hawthorns are very similar to crab apples. They're both susceptible to some rust diseases, as is the serviceberry. But for the most part, they're still worth planting, and they still produce a good amount of fruit. And lastly, American persimmon is a really good option also for producing food for us. These are really tasty, large fruits, and they're good for birds as well. So you'll need to plant. There are some cultivars that are self-fertile, but for the most part, you'll have to plant a male and a female tree close enough together. So finishing up the last few slides, you can find native plants at a number of places in our area. I also have this link on my website where you can find more. There's also a map there with a number of other locations. So if you're not directly, in the Philadelphia or lower Montgomery County area, you can find more options there. But these are just some places where you can get some native plants this year. And a lot of these places will have trees and herbaceous plants, so you can check those out. And they usually have staff there that are very helpful and willing to answer your questions. I just wanted to end with 3 or 4 other things that you can do besides planting to help birds and to help other wildlife on your property. If you have dead wood, or if you have a tree in the back of your property, and if it falls, it's not going to take out anything else, you can consider leaving that as a standing snag like these trees here. Dead wood is incredibly valuable for wildlife. It supports a ton of insects and beetles that will bore into the wood, and fungi and microscopic organisms that will eat the wood. And also it will attract woodpeckers that will eat those insects, and a lot of things will make cavities in the dead wood, which they'll nest in. So it's a really incredible asset if you're able to keep these around. Obviously, you don't want to keep it if it's next to your house or anything, but if it's in the back corner, definitely consider that. And this actually, they did this at Stoneleigh. There was a big old London plane tree that was declining for many years, and eventually it died. They decided to, instead of taking it down to the ground, they just made it safe. They topped it and got rid of a lot of the big branches, and they they're going to keep this as a dead snag so that wildlife can use it as it degrades, as it breaks down. And it's right near, the center of the garden and right near this building. So it's like really kind of shocking and really cool display of a snag right in the middle of the property. So that's pretty cool. You can also leave your leaves in the fall if you can find spots to leave leaves that fall on the ground. This will really help overwintering insects from caterpillars to fireflies to bees. A lot of insects will overwinter in the leaf litter. So if we're, packing all of those leaves off and they're, you're not keeping them on your property, a lot of those insects may not make it through the winter. But if you leave more on your property, you're helping to improve soil conditions and nutrients and moisture for your tree, which will help the health of your tree, and also providing a lot for wildlife. A lot of birds will kind of forage in the leaf litter throughout the winter as well. Other things you can do, you can also leave your cat indoors. This is a pretty controversial one, but cats are incredibly efficient hunters and they kill an incredible amount of birds and small mammals and reptiles. And I love cats. Domestic cats should not be outside though. They should be indoors and it's also safer for them. So leave your cat indoors. Also, try to avoid hiring Mosquito Joe and other folks who will spray for mosquitoes in your area, and instead try these mosquito dunks instead of spraying. This will kill some mosquitoes, but it will kill tons of other good beneficial insects, and it won't keep the mosquitoes in control. It will kill a lot of the native predatory insects, and oftentimes mosquitoes will just pop right back. So avoid spraying these pesticides if you can. And also avoid using rodenticides as that can travel up the food chain. And there's been cases of predatory birds becoming sick from eating prey that was killed by rodenticide. I have this video, but I'm going to skip over it. Essentially, you can change your outdoor lighting to a yellow LED or a red colored LED, which will attract far fewer insects to your light at night. If you have like a white, a normal colored light, a lot of insects will flock to that light and they'll be exhausted by flying around it. They kind of get trapped in this, around your light and they'll get exhausted or burnt. And that's unfortunately a leading cause of death for a lot of insects, including a lot of moth species that come out at night. But if you change to these warmer wavelengths of light, like the yellow light or the red light, those insects are not attracted to those wavelengths. So you'll be helping to reduce the amount of insects that you're accidentally killing with keeping the lights on outside. Alternatively, you can just turn the lights off and not keep them on outside, or you can set up a motion sensor light, which will help with that as well. If you leave your And lastly, I encourage you to add water features to your property. And these are great where you can put one of those mosquito dunks in. Those dunks don't affect birds or any other wildlife. They only target mosquito larvae. So it's completely safe to put in a bird bath or a pond. But the more water, especially during droughts, the more water features you have on your property, the better. More birds are going to be able to drink out of it, take, a bird bath, and it's just an incredible resource to have. So I think that is it. That's all of my slides. So I hope this was helpful, and I hope you came up with a list of species you may want to consider adding, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So, Andrew, can you hear me? We were trying to unmute.
Yes.
Okay, great. So would you like me to read you the questions? And then you
Sure.
can we do have some. Thank you, everybody. And I loved this, Andrew. I was taking notes like crazy. So I'm going to go to the top of the list. So we did talk a little bit about host plants. We were mentioning the shagbark hickory, I think, as one of those. So when it is, well, how would you define a host plant? That's a better way for me to ask.
Yeah, a host plant is just the species of plant that is needed by that insect. So for example, the monarch butterfly's host plant is milkweed because the monarch needs milkweed um, to survive and to reproduce. So the host plant is just the species of plant that insect can feed on.
Okay, that's great. And then this person had a question, Kateri had a question about cultivars, and I'm glad she did because me too. So she said,
Mhm.
I apologize if this question goes past the scope of this presentation, but are the benefits of a straight native species nullified if you can only find cultivars at the plant nursery?
Yeah, so no, cultivars, a lot of cultivars are completely good. They provide the same or more wildlife benefit. Um, Dr. Doug Tallamy did research on cultivars, and he found that the only cultivars that reduce wildlife value are the ones that change leaf color. So if you have um, a native plant that's, most plants are green leaves. If you have that and there's a cultivar that changes it to purple leaves, you're changing the leaf chemistry. There's a lot more anthocyanins in purple leaves that make it harder or more nasty to our native insects that usually eat that plant. So it becomes uh, less edible or less palatable for our native insects. But the other things that cultivars do usually, oh, I also forgot the double flowered cultivars of plants. So if you're taking like the spots on the flowers where bees are pollinating, getting the nectar and the pollen, a lot of double flowered cultivars. Let me see if I can bring it up here. Double flowered cultivars are one to avoid as well if you're looking for, um, if you're looking at plants that won't provide as much as the straight species. So in this case, like where the bee would normally pollinate is becoming inaccessible to the insect because this cultivar has selected for more flower petals here. So ultimately, yes, just avoid the double flowered cultivars and the cultivars that change leaf color. But the rest of them, like if it changes the size of the overall plant, if it changes the bloom time or how many flowers it has, usually those have no significant difference on wildlife benefits. So you just have to look up what that cultivar does and
Ah,
evaluate that. Yeah.
okay, because that was going to be part of my question too. You had mentioned that red maples have a number of different, and I think you said cultivars available. So we don't have to worry about, because it's a cultivar, that doesn't automatically make it a problem. We just might want to look it up as for that particular.
Right.
Okay,
Yes. And
all right.
most cultivars of red maple are changing the size of the overall plant. Like a lot of cultivars make the tree more compact, so that doesn't affect wildlife value. Um, yeah.
Okay, that's great. And when you were talking about, I'll just do, this happens to be mine, but it's the next question. You were talking about how long it takes for the trees to have acorns, the oaks.
Mhm.
And thanks to Andrew, we now have two replacement white oaks in our yard. We had what was supposedly one of the oldest ones in Monco that we finally had to take down a few years ago before it fell on the house. But so how long does it take for white oaks to have acorns?
It all depends on the setting. I think if you plant a white oak in full sun, it might take 15 to 20 years or more.
Wow.
If it's in the shade, it could be 50 or 60 or 70 years before they
Okay.
start producing. So, yeah, white oak is slower growing, but once it starts producing acorns and getting up there in height and size, it's really nothing can beat it in terms of wildlife value.
Well, and even before the acorns, we are still, it's a good resource for the all the different insects.
Yeah,
right?
and I planted a white oak from acorn that I collected 3 years ago. I planted it in my backyard, and the tree's only 2.5 feet tall, 3 feet tall, after 3 years now. And this was the first year that some of those galls I talked about earlier
Yeah,
found the little white oak, and so it's already supporting some insects and hopefully some birds too, even though it's only 2 or 3 feet tall.
perfect. Okay. And then the next question is, are there any shrubby oak species suitable for clay soil?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think so. I don't know how well those two species I mentioned would do in clay soil since they usually like the really well-drained sandy soils. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of information out about how well these species will perform in like garden settings or in clay soil. But I would guess that they may not do too well because, like I said, they have a preference for, the drier, well-drained stuff. But you could try it if you have like, a sunny spot and if you come across one of these in the nursery, but I'm not sure how well those two would do. And unfortunately, those are the only two dwarf oak species in our area that are native.
Okay. All right, that's helpful. And I think we talked about this, but just in case there's a little bit more, why can't caterpillars eat purple leaves?
Yeah, those cultivars change the leaf chemistry throughout the growing season, so yeah, we mentioned it makes it harder for them to either break down or digest those chemicals once they eat them. So they tend not to eat them as often as they would, a normal green leaf straight
Got it.
species.
Okay, great. And then is there a deer resistant rose shrub?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know as much about the native roses. Uh, we've used them in a couple projects, and we always fence them in just in case. But uh, roses they all have thorns on them. So my guess would be like once it gets to a certain size, like if you can protect it until it's a good size, the deer may nibble on the new growth before those thorns harden. But my guess is that once those thorns, mature and that new growth solidifies, deer probably won't pick at it too much. They certainly leave the multiflora rose, the invasive one, alone, but I don't know from experience personally with the native roses.
Okay, that's good though. That's a good thought. I'm thinking of the hawthorn trees and some of the long thorns.
Yeah,
Hopefully,
yeah, those are serious.
that's good. Okay, so if you are buying shrubs at a nursery, how can you tell if they are male or female?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like a lot of times nurseries will have them labeled, like for example with the winterberry holly, they sell male cultivars and female cultivars, and it's pretty complicated with the winterberries because they say like you need this cultivar, this male cultivar and this female cultivar because they bloom at the same time. So buy these two and plant them near each other and you'll have berries on the female.
Okay,
But for like if you're buying like a spice bush, a straight species spice bush, which is either male or female, unfortunately, if unless the plant is very large and it has already flowered in the nursery, you can't be sure if you're buying a male or a female until it flowers. So I would say that if you buy, three uh three spice bush or something and you plant them in a little cluster, chances are pretty good that you'll have at least one male and one female. But you could, the more, obviously, if you do five or seven, you can increase those odds. But yeah, sometimes there's a way to tell and sometimes not. But generally, you need to wait till it flowers.
and so I'm going to ask a dumb question. If it flowers, that means,
So when it flowers, you can see the flower parts and you can see if it has the stamens in the flower, that means it's a male, so it will produce the pollen. And if it has the female flower parts, you have to look under a mic and under a a magnifying glass sometimes to see the flower parts. But once it flowers, you'll be able to see if it has male or female flower parts, and that's how you'll be able to tell.
Okay, so it literally is a different configuration. Good. Yeah, I wasn't sure. Okay, as you can tell, Andrew is educating me. I am not nearly as knowledgeable about plants as I want to be or should be. Let's see. If leaves stay for the winter, if we leave leaves so it nourishes for over the winter for the bugs and the birds, is it okay to remove them in the spring, kind of clean up your yard at that point?
Yeah, I think maybe leaving them a little bit, at least until mid-spring or late spring when things have really warmed up and a lot of the organisms that may have been overwintering in them have woken up and become active again. I think maybe then you can do a little bit of cleaning up, but you can also, if you can try composting some of the leaves, so putting them in a pile and mixing it with other compost, or you can also, like, if your township does leaf collection and they mulch or they compost them, that's sometimes a good option too. A lot of overwintering insects may get uh, destroyed if they mulch the leaves before they put it in, but yeah, I think the longer you can keep the leaves, the better. But I think by late spring you should be okay to remove some or
So
move
late
them.
spring really meaning more like June, May, June, late May, June timeframe.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and then one final comment, also many bees over winter, so hollow stems. So leaving stems in the garden instead of cutting them down is also something that's good for the bugs and the birds. And then
Totally.
the final comment that I certainly echo, and I would bet many of us do, this is from John. That was a polished, professional, and thorough presentation. Thank you so much for educating folks like us on this important topic. And boy, that's for
Thank you.
sure. We have,
Thank you, John. Yeah.
Pat and I have two programs coming up about birds and spring migration, but with garden groups. So I was taking notes like crazy because this is going to be perfect additional information on some of the plants and the whys and hows. So thank you very, very much.
Great. I'm happy to hear that. And if anyone would like a copy of this, I can send you the link to this PowerPoint so you can reference these species and consider them for your landscape.
And so if you're going to do that, let me just mention, he changed the name of their company, so I'm going to double check and be correct. So if you look him up under Community Canopy Project, that is the name of their nonprofit, Community Canopy Project. And then you'll be able to find all this good stuff and email him as well. And that will be a great way. We also will have this on our website, valleyforgeaudubon.org. So that will be great. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Andrew. This was great.
Great. And thank you. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
We got a lot of compliments in the chat, so be sure and
Yes.
take a look.
Thank you all. I
All right. Good
appreciate
night,
it.
everyone. Thank you so much for coming.